Up until this time, these images of a bulldozer dumping naked, emaciated corpses into a mass grave at Bergen-Belsen were the most horrifying imagery in the history of film. This film footage was shown to our grandparents' generation on a big screen. It has been shown to you at a young age. What are you to believe? Some programs, such as the Oprah presentation, lead one to assume this is a German driving this bulldozer, making his quota of gas Jews for the day, rather than a British soldier pushing epidemic typhus victims into a mass grave. Until the end of the war, Bergen-Belsen was not a death camp where Germans deliberately starved to death and murdered prisoners. In fact, it was originally designated as a recuperation camp, or Krankenlager, where sick prisoners were sent to improve their health. It wasn't such a terrible place until the final days of the war, and there is evidence to prove it. Rose Kahn, a Hungarian Jew, was transported from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen in the summer of 1944. Before Auschwitz was abandoned and Bergen-Belsen was severely overcrowded, she describes Bergen-Belsen as not such a terrible place.
So when we arrived to Bergen-Belsen, and they told us to get out, and the Nazis came with those big dogs, with the wolves, and they asked us, who cannot walk, is sick, should tell him, so they're going to put us on a bus. I was afraid to say it. I couldn't walk, but I didn't say it. And if I would say, it would be good, because this was not a bad place. This was not, at that time.
So in other words, it wasn't a trick? They really would have taken you by bus?
Yes.
I think you were right.
Yeah, but I was so afraid. So my mother and my friends were holding me and helping. We had to walk a few miles, quite a few miles, to it. And we arrived there, and we lived in tents, tents and straw. We slept on straw, and we weren't treated badly. No, it wasn't too bad over there. We were giving nice meals. Nice. What happened? They wanted us strong to send out to work. So they didn't want weak and sick people.
Witnesses such as this help prove that Bergen-Belsen was not a specially designed death camp whatsoever. Before the catastrophic end of the war, prisoners were routinely fed and decently cared for. The major trick of the Holocaust promotion industry is to show these horrible images of emaciated bodies and make you believe that prisoners were always like this, that the Germans immediately starved them to death, and this deliberate starvation had been going on for years as part of their plan of extermination. However, witnesses such as this and others prove that at times the concentration camps were not so terrible.
This was not a bad place. This was not at that time.
It was only as Germany was losing the war, surrounded on all sides by a terror bombing campaign from the West and marauding Soviets in the East, that conditions in camps such as Bergen-Belsen deteriorated disastrously.
And then we stayed there till they started to build barracks for all the other Auschwitz people when Bergen-Belsen became hell.
Bergen-Belsen became hellish at the very end of the war. The major cause of this was the Allied bombing campaign, as the Allies firebombed German civilian population centers, burning innocent men, women, and children alive, and shot at or bombed just about anything that moved on roads or train tracks. Even the Germans themselves had trouble finding enough to eat at the time.
Hardly food. It was very meager already. The Germans didn't have to eat.
Food didn't improve very much because simple reason, they didn't have it very much themselves. So,
did the civilians try to help you at all? Did they trade goods for things?
It's as I say, that we have almost everything what we wanted for that soccer teams from the civilians, from outside civilians.
The spread of deadly diseases and severe overcrowding exacerbated the entire situation. Prisoners from areas in the east, which were now being overrun by the Soviets, were hastily evacuated west. After days or weeks' journey, often on foot, they wound up in these overcrowded camps full of deadly diseases. And because the German infrastructure was being destroyed, this was catastrophic. In early February 1945, a large transport of Jews was admitted to Bergen-Belsen while the disinfestation facility was out of order. As a result, typhus broke out and quickly spread beyond control. The hot air delousing machine sometimes failed to work for several days. The worst killer was typhus, but typhoid fever and dysentery also claimed their lives. There was a breakdown in order and communication throughout the German system as the Germans were losing the war and fighting for their survival. Trainloads of food were destroyed by Allied planes. At Bergen-Belsen, the final factor which guaranteed mass casualties was in the final weeks of the war. The Allies bombed the power plant which supplied electricity to the facilities that pumped water to the camp.
Water, too, had been cut off, and so the water cart was the most important thing to arrive. There had been no water supply for 6 days. The Germans pleaded it had been cut.
The electric plant which powered pumps supplying water to Bergen-Belsen was not cut by some unnamed force. It was blown up by the British. A destroyed system for providing clean water to the camp compounded already disastrous hygiene and medical conditions. Clean water, necessary to shower prisoners, wash clothing, and treat dehydrated typhoid fever, dysentery, and typhus patients, was indeed cut off by British bombs.
One might ask why all the inmates surviving were not removed out of the camp altogether to a large town, for example, where there would be feeding and housing facilities. The answer is simply the dread word, typhus. A mobile bacteriological unit and all medical aid possible to together with 90 medical students from London hospitals, were rushed to the spot to deal with it. Lack of soap and water brought lice to the inmates, and lice carry typhus. To get rid of typhus, one must first get rid of lice. So contaminated patients were removed from their huts and put through a laundry process.
The British struggled to remedy disastrous conditions in Bergen-Belsen after liberation. Many thousands died after liberation. In the end, the British burned the wooden barracks as they became infested with deadly epidemic typhus-carrying body lice. Images of the disastrous situation at Bergen-Belsen are fraudulently used to portray a deliberate German extermination policy. These post-liberation images of Bergen-Belsen, as well as Dachau and Nordhausen, have become symbols of German barbarism. But these people were victims of the larger war, not a deliberate German extermination policy. The Germans did what they could to keep people alive, and in some cases contacted the Red Cross for assistance, and even turned over some camps to them. The shameful truth hidden amongst this Holocaust propaganda is that not only were none of these people gassed, but the Allies played a major role in their deaths. As terrible as these images of emaciated prisoners are, images of Union prisoners of the American Confederate Civil War camp Andersonville show liberated prisoners also appeared in a similar condition. What happened at Andersonville was a complete breakdown in hygiene measures due to inadequate sanitation facilities. Toilets in the overcrowded camp didn't drain properly, exposing prisoners to filth and disease, in particular dysentery. Symptoms of dysentery include diarrhea and rapid weight loss. In extreme cases, patients may pass over a liter of fluid per hour. It's easy to see how someone who is repeatedly defecating, vomiting, and urinating would quickly lose body weight, especially if food supplies, medicine, and water became scarce. At Andersonville, as overcrowding increased, so did the death toll. The Confederates also lost the war in a catastrophic way, much like the Germans. So there is a direct correlation between the images of Andersonville prisoners and the so-called Holocaust images. Now, these people at Andersonville aren't Jews, and never has anyone alleged that the South aimed for a total genocide of Northerners. The photographs of Andersonville and, for instance, Bergen-Belsen are quite similar and correlate with the breakdown in hygiene, overcrowding, the spread of disease, and one side of the war losing catastrophically. What you see in these images at Bergen-Belsen is primarily the result of typhus. Typhus is a disease carried by the body louse, which is similar to head lice. But body lice prefer to attach themselves not to the scalp, but to the inner seams of clothing. Typhus was responsible for the deaths of millions throughout history. Typhus epidemics routinely occurred throughout Europe during wartime. During World War I, more than 3 million people died from typhus. What you see in these images are primarily typhus epidemic victims. The Germans did not intentionally starve them to death. We can see several people liberated from the camps. Although not in pristine condition, some appear well fed, some even fat. They simply didn't have disease. The Germans, in fact, tried to stop the spread of disease. The insecticide Zyklon B was a pesticide used to kill these deadly typhus-carrying body lice. There's nothing inherently murderous about Zyklon B. In fact, Zyklon B was used on the Mexican border to gas the clothing of Mexicans crossing the border. The delousing process went like this. Prisoners entering a camp would strip their clothing and get a haircut to prevent any areas where deadly typhus-carrying body lice could thrive. Then they would take a hot shower. At the same time, their clothing would be put into specially designed fumigation chambers, where fumigation crews would use the insecticide Zyklon B to kill deadly typhus-carrying body lice. The prisoners would then be given clean, lice-free clothing and enter the camp. It is easy to see how this life-saving delousing process involving real fumigation chambers for clothing and real showers was misconstrued into wartime propaganda about showers of gas by prisoners spreading rumors, as well as Soviet propaganda artists deliberately framing their enemies. One of the final exhibits at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., sums up the importance of the information presented in this video. Museum visitors are bombarded with film clips taken after the Allies captured concentration and labor camps. These films are meant to represent proof of a deliberate German extermination policy. But you've now seen many of these clips explained and debunked. Near the end of the museum's main exhibit, 2 banks of 3 video monitors flanking a fallen Nazi flag play film footage taken after camps were captured by the Allies. Each of the 3 monitors is dedicated to one of the 3 major Allied powers, the Soviet Union, United States, and Great Britain. On this screen is U.S. Army footage taken at Nordhausen, Dachau, and Buchenwald. The caption reads, "Local German civilians are ordered to tour Buchenwald concentration camp." This is an American Army official gathering Germans around the supposed human skin lampshade and the table filled with propaganda props. Visitors are shown the Dachau death trains full of victims of Allied bombing and strafing attacks. Medonic, the outside of a real shower facility, Bath and Disinfection 2, and the inside of Bath and Disinfection 1, showing the real working shower room. Again, the camera is angled away from the many windows. The caption reads, "Soviet Army officers inspect chambers where prisoners were killed by poison gas." Today, every serious mainstream historian acknowledges this wasn't a gas chamber with fake shower heads. It was a real working shower room designed to keep prisoners alive and free of disease. Again, the bulldozer pushing epidemic typhus victims into a mass grave at Bergen-Belsen. A disaster, but not deliberate or planned. On the last television screen, we're shown footage of Nordhausen bombed to smithereens by 500 British warplanes over 2 days. Much like at the Nuremberg trials, the final shot we are shown before moving on to the exhibit on post-war trials is the victim of British warplanes at Nordhausen with his exposed brains. How sick to show gory imagery of Allied air attack victims as proof of the evilness of Germans. Mothers rushing their children past this section never question the context of this imagery. This is powerful, trauma-based mind control used to brainwash, not by using logic and facts, but by searing these horror images into a captive audience's mind and manipulating emotions with mendacious narrations.